There's a specific kind of stubbornness that comes with being 40 female and utterly alone in the Wyoming Territory. It's the kind of hard-headed grit that will absolutely get you killed if you let it. I watched her fight the mud for 3 hours. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She just dug her hands bleeding into the clay. She was 40 and needed absolutely no one, until the axle cracked. That was when I stepped out of the tree line and said, "Let me help. The road up to my claim isn't a road. It's a suggestion." A pair of faint wagon ruts carved into the side of the mountain by stubbornness and run off, swallowed by lodgepole pines and choked with deadfall. No one comes up here by accident. You have to be lost, or you have to be running. I was up on the ridge tracking a limping elk when I heard the crack. It echoed like a rifle shot, sharp and unnatural against the steady hush of the autumn wind. I dropped low, waited. 10 minutes passed. No secondary shot, no smell of black powder, just the frantic, rhythmic thud of a draft horse blowing hard, struggling against leather traces. I slid down the scree slope, keeping the wind in my face, my Winchester resting easy in the crook of my arm. I didn't like visitors. I liked surprises even less. Through the thinning pines I saw the wagon. It was a Conestoga scaled down beat to hell, canvas patched with sailcloth and flour sacks. The right rear wheel was buried to the hub in a clay sinkhole, the wagon bed tilted at a sickening 30-degree angle. And then I saw her. She wasn't a girl. The frontier ate girls alive. She was a woman solid and weathered. 40, maybe a hard 38. She had her heavy wool skirt hiked up and knotted at her thigh, revealing men's heavy leather boots caked in mud. A faded felt hat was pulled low over her eyes. She was wedging a thick branch of mountain mahogany under the trapped wheel, throwing her entire body weight against the makeshift lever. Her draft horse, a massive roan gelding, lunged forward. The harness groaned. The wagon shrieked. The wood snapped. She went down hard in the mud. The horse stumbled back, blowing wet, exhausted breaths. I stayed in the trees. I wanted to see what she would do. Most folks, men included, would have thrown a fit. Sworn at God, kicked the wagon, sat in the muck and wept. She didn't. She pushed herself up slowly, wiped a streak of grey mud from her cheek with the back of a filthy, bleeding hand. She walked over to the horse, ran a hand down its trembling neck, and murmured something I couldn't catch. Then she turned, picked up another branch, and walked right back to the wheel. She was going to dig until her heart gave out. I stepped out of the brush. Her head snapped toward me. Her hand went to the belt at her waist. The Colt Navy revolver she drew was old, but the hammer clicked back with a smooth, well-oiled sound. She didn't shake. She pointed it dead at my chest. "Far enough," she said. Her voice was raspy dry as cracked earth. I stopped. I didn't raise my hands, just kept the rifle pointed at the dirt. "You're burning out your beast." "He's my beast to burn." She shot back. Her eyes narrowed. They were a pale, washed-out blue, flanked by deep laugh lines that didn't look like they'd seen much use lately. "State your business. You're on my road." She glanced around, taking in the steep incline, the dense pines, the sheer drop-off to her left. Didn't see a toll booth. Didn't build one, mostly because the road ends at my cabin 2 miles up. I shifted my weight. "You missed the fork to the valley." "I know where I am." "Then you know you're stuck." I looked at the wheel. The axle housing was resting flush against the mud. "And you're not getting out of that with a stick." She didn't lower the gun. "I'll manage." "Suit yourself." I turned to walk away. I took 3 steps before she spoke. "Wait." I stopped, looked over my shoulder. The gun was lowered, though not holstered. She was looking at the horse. The roan's head was hanging low, flanks heaving. She could afford to be stubborn, but she wouldn't let the animal pay the price for it. That told me a lot about her. "I have a block and tackle," she said quietly. "But I can't rig it high enough on the pine alone." I need— She swallowed hard, the muscles in her throat working. The word tasted like ash in her mouth. I need a hand. I turned back, walked past the barrel of her gun right up to the wagon. Let me help. We didn't talk. We worked. I stripped off my heavy canvas coat. The air was biting, hovering just above freezing, but the exertion warmed me fast. She dug the block and tackle out of the wagon bed. It was heavy iron, greased and well-maintained. I'm Callan, I said, unspooling the thick hemp rope. Cora. She grunted, tossing me the heavy iron hook. That was it. No life stories, no polite inquiries about the weather. We had a mechanical problem to solve, and the sky above the mountain was turning the color of a bruised plum. A front was moving in. Fast. I scaled the nearest sturdy lodgepole bark, scraping my forearms, and lashed the primary block to a thick branch, about 15 feet up. By the time I dropped back to the dirt, Cora had already rigged the lower block to the rear axle and cleared away the debris from the tire iron. You know your rigging, I said. Wasn't always a widow, she replied flatly. The word hung there heavy and cold. She didn't offer any more, and I didn't pry. The West was full of ghosts. I had my own sitting in a shallow grave 3 states away. We all carry our dead. We unhitched the roan and led him up the trail, attaching the draw rope to his collar. When I say pull, you walk him, I told her, taking my place at the back of the wagon. I shoved a thick slab of rock beneath the axle housing. I'll guide the wheel. She nodded, took the lead rope, placed a hand on the horse's nose. Ready. Pull. Cora clucked her tongue. The roan surged forward. The rope snapped taut, humming like a plucked guitar string. The block overhead groaned. I threw my shoulder against the back of the wagon, my boots sliding in the slick mud. Hold him steady! I yelled over the creaking wood. The wheel sucked at the mud. A thick, wet, tearing sound. The wagon shuddered, lifting a 1/4 inch, a 1/2 inch. Keep him moving! Cora leaned into the pool alongside the horse, her boots digging into the dirt, her jaw locked, the muscles in her forearms corded. The mud gave way with a loud schloop. The back end of the wagon cleared the sinkhole, suspended for a frantic second in the air. Whoa, slack off! She backed the horse up a 1/2 step. I shoved the rock slab directly under the iron rim of the wheel. The wagon came down hard, but it sat solid on the stone, not in the mud. I exhaled a long breath, wiping the sweat from my eyes. My hands were coated in freezing muck. I looked over at Cora. She was leaning against the horse, her chest heaving. A fine sheen of sweat mixed with the dirt on her face. Then the first flake of snow fell. It landed on the leather trace. Then another on her shoulder. Within 10 seconds, the wind picked up, howling through the pines, carrying a biting, stinging sleet. The temperature plummeted 15 degrees in a heartbeat. I walked over to the wheel, ran my hand along the wooden spokes. The second one from the bottom was splintered halfway through. The axle was holding, but barely. Wheels fractured, I said, raising my voice over the rising wind. You can't drive on this, not fully loaded, and definitely not down the mountain. Cora walked over, staring at the split wood. She closed her eyes for a long second. When she opened them, they were stone. I have tools, wood glue, I can brace it. Not in a blizzard, you can't. I pointed up the trail. The grey wall of the storm was rapidly swallowing the tree line, eating the mountain whole. You have an hour of daylight left. The snow will be knee-deep by midnight. You stay out here, you'll freeze to the bench. She looked at the sky, looked at her wagon, looked at me. The distrust was palpable, a physical wall between us. She had spent a long time relying only on herself. Handing over control, even just for a night, felt like a defeat. My cabin is 2 miles up, I said. It's dry. There's a lean-to for the horse. Tomorrow we fix the wheel. She looked at her freezing hands. Her knuckles were split, bleeding sluggishly in the cold. She hated it. She hated needing the help. But she wasn't a fool. She knew a death sentence when she saw one. Fine, she said, her voice clipped. Lead the way. The ride up was brutal. The sleet turned to driving snow, thick and blinding. I walked ahead of the horse, breaking the trail, while Cora led the roan. By the time my cabin materialized out of the whiteout, we were both shivering uncontrollably, our clothes frozen stiff like armor. The cabin was small. Rough-hewn logs chinked with mud and horsehair, an oversized fieldstone chimney dominating one wall. It wasn't pretty, but it was fortified. I pointed to the lean-to attached to the side. Put him in there. There's dry hay in the corner. Trough water might have a layer of ice on it. I moved to unbuckle the horse's harness, but she swatted my hand away. I tend to my own animals, she said. Her teeth were chattering so hard the words came out fractured. Suit yourself. I went inside. It was freezing in the cabin, the fire having died down to grey ash hours ago. I threw kindling on the grate, blew the embers to life, and stacked split birch and pine on top. Within minutes the fire roared, casting long, dancing shadows across the single room. I lit the kerosene lamp on the table. The door opened. Cora stepped in, dragging her saddlebags. She kicked the door shut with her heel and stood there, snow melting off her hat, dripping onto the floorboards. She looked around. A bed in the corner, a heavy oak table, cast iron pans hanging from the wall, a rifle rack, no curtains, no doilies, no signs of anyone else. She stripped off her wet coat and draped it over the back of a chair. Underneath, she wore a heavy flannel man's shirt, loose and practical. She walked to the hearth, holding her hands out to the flames. She was shaking violently now, the adrenaline wearing off, leaving only the bone-deep cold. I filled a tin pot with water from the bucket and hooked it over the fire to boil. Take your boots off, I said, pulling a spare wool blanket from the chest at the foot of my bed. Put this around you. She eyed the blanket. I'm fine. You've got the hypothermia shakes, Cora. You're not fine. Take the boots off before your toes go black. I tossed the blanket onto the chair next to her. I didn't wait to see if she obeyed. I walked to the small counter and started grinding coffee beans. Behind me, I heard the heavy thud of a muddy boot hitting the floor. Then the other. When I turned back with 2 tin cups of steaming coffee, she was wrapped in the grey wool, sitting close to the hearth. She took the cup with both hands. The heat made her wince. I sat at the table a few feet away, giving her space. In the quiet of the cabin, the only sounds were the crackle of the pitch pine and the howling wind rattling the heavy window shutters. I took a sip of my coffee and watched her. She was bruised. There was a dark purple smudge along her jawline where she must have hit the wagon when she fell. Her hands were a mess of raw blisters and cracked skin. On her left hand, on her ring finger, there was a distinct pale indentation. A phantom ring. She caught me looking. She didn't hide the hand. She just met my gaze, challenging me to ask. I didn't. Instead, I reached into the drawer of the table, pulled out a small tin, and slid it across the wood toward her. Bear, tallow, and calendula, I said. For the blisters. Keep the air off them. She looked at the tin, then at me. I said, I don't need... I know what you said. I cut her off, my voice low but hard. I heard you the first time. You don't need anyone. You're tough as boiled owl. I get it. But your hands are bleeding on my floor, and you won't be able to grip a hammer tomorrow to fix your wheel if they get infected. She stared at me. Her pale blue eyes searched mine, looking for pity or condescension or a trap. I gave her none of it. Just flat, pragmatic truth. Slowly her shoulders dropped. The rigid tension in her spine eased just a fraction. She reached out, picked up the tin, and popped the lid. The smell of rendered fat and herbs filled the space between us. Thank you, she muttered, rubbing the salve into her raw palms. She winced, biting her lower lip. You got a destination, Cora? I asked, looking down at my coffee. Oregon, she said. Oregon's a long way from a private trail in Wyoming. I took a wrong turn. Must have been one hell of a wrong turn. She stopped rubbing her hands. She looked into the fire, the flames reflecting in her eyes. I was following a map my husband drew. Turns out he was full of shit about a lot of things, his sense of direction included. It was the first piece of herself she'd offered. A small, jagged shard of truth. I nodded slowly. I lifted my right hand to take another drink of coffee. In the firelight, the scars were stark. 2 fingers missing at the second knuckle, the skin puckered and burned all the way down the back of my hand to the wrist. Cora's eyes tracked the movement. She saw the maimed hand. She didn't gasp. She didn't look away out of polite embarrassment. She just looked at it, understanding the universal language of survival. Looks like we both followed bad maps, I said quietly. She took a slow sip of her coffee, her eyes locked on mine over the rim of the tin cup. Looks like we did. The wind screamed against the cabin walls, trying to tear the roof off. But inside, the fire held it back. We sat in silence. 2 people who had spent their lives building walls suddenly realizing we were sitting in the exact same room. I woke to the sound of metal scraping cast iron. The cabin was freezing, the kind of cold that sinks into your marrow and makes your joints ache. The fire had burned down to a dull, pulsing orange bed of coals. I was lying on my bedroll near the hearth, wrapped in a heavy buffalo hide. I opened one eye. Cora was at the stove. She had a heavy coat back on the collar turned up against her neck. She was using my spatula to scrape a block of salt pork into the skillet. I watched her for a long minute. She moved with an economy of motion. No wasted steps. She cracked 3 eggs into the popping fat, nudging the yolks with the edge of the metal blade. She didn't look over at me, but she knew I was awake. Eggs are from the root cellar, she said, her voice gravelly with sleep and cold. Found a jar of pickled tomatoes, too. Figured we needed the salt. Help yourself. I grunted, pushing back the hide and sitting up. My breath plumed in the air. I pulled my boots on, stiff and cold, and stomped my heels into the leather. I walked over to the window and unlatched the heavy wooden shutter. The world outside was gone. The mountain had vanished. The tree line a mere 50 yards away was obscured by a relentless driving wall of white. The snow wasn't falling. It was moving horizontally, driven by a gale-force wind that shrieked through the chinking of the cabin logs. It had piled up against the glass halfway up the window pane. How deep? Cora asked from the stove. 3 feet on the flat, I said, squinting through the frosted glass. Drifts are probably 5 or 6, and it's not letting up. She slid the eggs and pork onto 2 tin plates. She didn't say anything, but the rigid set of her shoulders spoke volumes. She walked to the table, set the plates down, and pulled out a chair. We ate in silence. The food was hot, heavy with grease, exactly what you needed when your body was burning calories just to stay warm. I watched her hands. The raw blisters from the wagon wheel were shiny with the tallow salve I'd given her, the swelling down a fraction. She held her fork with a stiff, careful grip. I need to check the horse, she said, scraping the last bit of egg from her plate. Lean-to is sheltered from the north wind, I replied. But the trough will be frozen solid. You'll need the axe. I handed her my splitting maul as we geared up. I pulled on my canvas coat, a wool scarf, and thick leather mittens. When I opened the cabin door, the wind hit us like a physical blow. It sucked the air straight out of my lungs. We waded through waist-high drifts to the side of the cabin. The roan was huddled in the corner of the lean-to, his heavy winter coat, puffed-out breath steaming. Cora went straight to him. She didn't coo or baby the animal. She ran hard, calloused hands over his flanks, checking for shivers, checking his legs. She took them all and smashed the 2-inch sheet of ice covering the water trough, then hauled a fresh bale of hay from the stack and cut the twine. I stood by the corner of the cabin looking down the trail, or rather where the trail used to be. It was a smooth, unbroken expanse of white. The wagon parked 2 miles down the ridge was likely buried to the canvas roof by now. Even if the wheel wasn't splintered, moving it would be impossible. Cora walked up beside me, holding them all. She followed my gaze down the mountain. The wind whipped her hat brim, stinging our faces with ice crystals. "When does it break?" She yelled over the roar of the gale. "Tomorrow, maybe the next day." I yelled back. "But the snow stays. It's too cold to melt. We're locked in." She stared at the white expanse. I saw the muscles in her jaw feather. The realization was hitting her a slow, crushing weight. She was 40 years old, fiercely independent, and she was trapped in a 10 by 12 box with a stranger relying on his roof, his food, his fire. To someone who had built her life around needing no one, this wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a failure. She suddenly stepped forward, pushing past me, wading into the deep snow toward the trail. "Where are you going?" I shouted. "To check my wagon." "Are you insane? It's 2 miles through chest-deep powder. I have supplies in there, grain for the horse tools." She was fighting the snow, her heavy boots sinking deep with every step, the wind fighting to push her backward. It was a futile, stubborn exertion. It was panic masking itself as action. I didn't stop her. I didn't grab her arm. I just watched her fight the mountain. She made it 20 yards before a hidden deadfall tripped her. She pitched forward, vanishing into a massive snowdrift. I waded out. By the time I reached her, she had pushed herself up to her knees. Her hat was gone. Her hair, a tangled mess of dark brown, streaked with silver, was plastered to her wet face. She was gasping for air, her chest heaving. She looked up at me. There were no tears, just a blazing, impotent rage. "It's buried, Cora," I said, keeping my voice dead level, cutting through the wind. "The grain is frozen. The tools are under 4 feet of ice. It's not going anywhere, and neither are you." "I can't stay here," she rasped, her voice cracking. "I can't be beholden. Not again." The words slipped out before she could catch them. A raw nerve exposed to the freezing air. I looked down at her. I didn't offer my hand. I knew she wouldn't take it. "You're not beholden," I said bluntly. "You're marooned. There's a difference. Nature doesn't care about your pride. It will freeze you solid whether you're fiercely independent or crying for your mother. Now get up. We need to haul firewood before we lose our fingers." I turned my back on her and trudged toward the woodpile. It took a few seconds, but I heard the wet crunch of snow behind me. She was following. We hauled armfuls of split pine back into the cabin. We slammed the door, bolted the heavy iron latch, and stood in the sudden ringing silence of the room. The heat of the fire hit our frozen faces like a furnace. Cora dropped her load of wood into the bin with a loud clatter. She stripped off her wet coat and hung it on the peg. She didn't look at me. She walked over to the fire, knelt on the hearth, and held her bare hands out to the flames. "I pay my way," she said to the fire. "I'm not a charity case." "Didn't say you were." I took off my coat, shaking the snow from the canvas. "You can cook. I'll split wood. We keep the fire fed. We keep the horse alive. When the thaw comes, we fix your wheel." She was quiet for a long time. The flames danced across the lines of her face. Finally, she gave a single curt nod. "Fine." It wasn't a truce, but it was a start. The storm broke on the 4th day. It didn't fade out. It just stopped. The wind died overnight, leaving a silence so absolute it made my ears ring. The morning sun hit the fresh snow, turning the mountain into a blinding, fractured mirror. It was beautiful in the way a drawn knife is beautiful. We were running through the cordwood faster than I anticipated. A draft horse ate a lot of hay, but 2 people existing in a drafty cabin ate a lot of pine. We needed to buck a fallen spruce I'd dragged up behind the cabin before the first snow. We stood on either side of the massive, rough-barked trunk. The snow was packed down in a trench around the tree. I handed Cora the wooden handle of the cross-cut saw. It was a 6-foot ribbon of jagged steel, meant for 2 men. "You ever run one of these?" I asked. "No." She gripped the handle, testing the weight. "It's not about strength. It's about timing," I told her. "You don't push, You only pull. When I pull, you let the blade glide. When you pull, I let it glide. If you push the blade bows and binds in the wood, you'll exhaust yourself in 5 minutes." She nodded. "I pull. You pull. Let's start on the narrow end." We set the teeth against the bark. I pulled. The blade scored the wood. She pulled. A curl of sawdust fell onto the white snow. Shook, shook. The sound of the saw tearing through the sapwood was a steady, rhythmic rasp. For the first few minutes it was awkward. Cora tried to force it, pushing the handle back toward me when it was my turn to pull. The blade bowed, pinching in the cut. "Stop," I said. "Let go of it. Let me pull it back." She exhaled a sharp breath, her breath pluming in the freezing air. "I'm trying." "Don't try. Just wait for the tension. Let the saw do the cutting." We started again. Pull, release, pull, release. Slowly the awkwardness faded. A mechanical rhythm took over. Our bodies fell into a pendulum swing, a shared momentum across the steel blade. Sawdust piled up a yellow mountain against the stark white snow. By the third log we were sweating despite the 10-degree air. We stopped to strip off our coats. Cora stood in her flannel shirt, her chest rising and falling, a smudge of pine sap on her cheek. "It was a land grant," she said suddenly. I looked up from clearing the sawdust out of the cut. I didn't say anything, just waited. She picked up a handful of snow and rubbed it on the back of her neck, closing her eyes against the shock of the cold. "Oregon, 300 acres in the Willamette Valley. Prime timber and water rights. That's what Thomas told me." "Your husband." She opened her eyes. The pale blue was flat, hardened. "My husband. He bought the deed off a man in a saloon in St. Louis. Spent our entire savings. 10 years of dry farming dust in Missouri, sold the farm, put the money into a piece of paper. I picked up my end of the saw. Let me guess. The paper was worthless." "Worse than worthless." She scoffed, gripping her handle. She pulled. The saw bit deep. "It was a forged claim. The land belonged to the railroad. We didn't find out until we reached Idaho. 2,000 miles for nothing." I pulled the saw back. Shook. "What did Thomas do?" "He panicked." She yanked the blade. "He couldn't face the failure. Couldn't face me. He took a bottle of cheap rye, walked out into the desert near Boise, and put his shotgun under his chin." The saw froze in the middle of the cut. I stared at her across the trunk of the tree. Her face was a mask of cold fury. She wasn't grieving a lost love. She was grieving the betrayal. She was angry at the cowardice. She had been left holding the bag, stranded in a hostile world with a broken wagon and a draft horse. "So you kept going," I said quietly. "I couldn't go back," she replied, her voice dropping, losing its hard edge. "There was nothing left. I figured if I just kept moving west, maybe I'd hit the ocean. Hard to get lost when you run out of land." We stood in the silence of the snow. The ghost of Thomas stood between us, a stark reminder of how fast the frontier breaks weak men. "You're not weak, Cora," I said. Her eyes snapped up to mine. She searched my face, looking for the lie. She didn't find one. "I'm not strong," she muttered. "I'm just entirely out of options." That's usually when people figure out exactly what they're made of. I shifted my grip on the handle. My wife was named Sarah. Cora's hands tightened on the wood. She went very still. "We had a claim down in Colorado. Small cabin, a few head of cattle." I looked down at the saw blade, tracing the jagged steel with my eyes. It was a dry summer. August. Lightning strike sparked a brush fire in the canyon. Wind pushed it up the ridge faster than a horse could run. I lifted my right hand. The scarred, maimed hand. I didn't hide it this time. I let her see the puckered, ruined flesh, the missing fingers. I tried to drag a burning beam off the roof. Roof came down. I dropped my hand back to the saw. I woke up 2 days later in a neighbor's wagon. They found me unconscious in the creek bed. Sarah didn't make it to the water. The silence returned heavier this time. But it wasn't the cold, hostile silence of the cabin. It was the silence of two battered animals recognizing the scars on each other. Cora stared at my hand for a long moment. Then she looked up into my eyes. The rigid tension in her jaw, the defensive armor she had worn since the moment I stepped out of the tree line, cracked. Just a hairline fracture, but it was there. "Callan," she said softly. "Yeah, I'm pulling." She leaned back. The saw glided through the wood. I pulled. The blade slid back to me. Shh, hook, shh, hook. We fell back into the rhythm. Push and pull, give and take. We cut through the dead wood, the sharp scent of pine filling the cold, clean air. We didn't talk any more that day. We didn't need to. The mountain had trapped us, but for the first time since the snow fell, the walls of the cabin didn't feel quite so narrow. We lost track of the days. The calendar on the wall was a piece of bank parchment from 1883, 3 years out of date. Its days crossed off by a man who had long since stopped caring what month it was. Winter on the mountain didn't have days. It had degrees of cold. It had the hours you spent awake to feed the fire, and the hours you spent asleep hoping the fire didn't die. The snow had packed down into a dense, icy crust. We dug a trench from the cabin door to the lean-to, and another out to the woodpile. It felt like living in a system of white caves. Inside, the cabin had shrunk. Or maybe we had just expanded to fill it. I was sitting by the hearth, a length of seasoned hickory resting across my thighs. I had a draw knife in my hands, a two-handled blade, designed for stripping bark and shaping rough wood. I was carving a replacement spoke for her wagon wheel. The original had shattered beyond repair, and hickory was the only wood hard enough to bear the weight of a loaded Conestoga. Cora was at the table. She had a canvas needle threaded with heavy twine, working a patch into the knee of her wool trousers. The firelight cast sharp shadows across her face. The bruising on her jaw had faded to a sickly yellow, then vanished entirely. Her hands were no longer a mess of raw blisters. The tallow salve had done its job turning the broken skin into thick, permanent calluses. The only sound in the room was the rhythmic tearing sound of the draw knife peeling ribbons of wood from the hickory shaft. Shrip. A long curl of pale wood fell to the floorboards. Shrip. "You're taking too much off the left side," Cora said. She didn't look up from her sewing. I stopped. I looked at the spoke. Then I looked at her. "I've built wagons from scratch, Cora. I know how to turn a spoke. I'm sure you have—" she replied, smoothly pulling the heavy twine through the wool with a sharp tug. "But the hub on my wheel is slightly warped from the Missouri heat. The mortise isn't perfectly square anymore. If you shave that tenon dead straight, it'll rattle loose in 10 miles. I ran my thumb along the shaved edge of the wood. The wood was cold, the grain tight. I looked at the angle she was talking about. She was right. The draft horse pulled unevenly to the right, which meant the left side of the hub took more torque. "You notice a lot for a woman who was trying to leverage a wagon out of a sinkhole with a stick," I muttered. "I notice everything," she said, finally looking up. Her pale blue eyes caught the firelight. "It's how I stay alive." I turned the knife, adjusting the angle of the blade, and took a shallower cut. Shrip. We had settled into a wary, functional truce. We moved around each other with the careful precision of two feral dogs sharing a small cage. But the hostility had burned off, replaced by something heavier. A physical awareness. In a 10 by 12 cabin, you learn how a person breathes. You learn the exact cadence of their footsteps. You learn what they look like when they wake up stripped of their armor before they remember to put their guard back up. I had learned that Cora didn't sleep soundly. She ground her teeth. Sometimes she'd wake up with a sharp gasp, her hand reaching for the empty space beside her on the bedroll, before her eyes would dart to the fire, and she'd remember where she was. She had learned that when the barometric pressure dropped, the burns on my hand throbbed like a crushed nerve. I never complained about it. I just gripped my coffee cup tighter. But she noticed. 2 days ago, without a word she had taken, the kettle boiled a rag, and laid the steaming cloth on the table next to my injured hand. She didn't make a big show of it. She just walked away. I had wrapped my hand in the heat, and the relief was staggering. "Hold this," I said, standing up. I walked over to the table and set the hickory spoke down in front of her. She put her needle down. "I need to plane the tenon," I told her. "I need you to brace it against the edge of the table. Keep it completely flat." She stood up. She placed both hands flat against the thick end of the hickory, throwing her weight forward to pin it against the oak table. I picked up my block plane, stepping in close to her right side. I placed my left hand on the wood inches from hers to guide the plane. My right hand gripped the iron tool. "Hold it steady," I said. I pushed the plane forward. The blade caught a knot in the hickory. The wood jerked. My scarred right hand slipped off the back of the tool. The lack of grip in my missing fingers meant I couldn't always stabilize the torque. The heavy iron plane skidded off the wood and slammed down hard onto the table, my knuckles scraping violently against the oak. I cursed, pulling my hand back. A fresh ribbon of blood welled up across the shiny, puckered scar tissue on the back of my hand. I turned away furious at the clumsiness, reaching for a rag on the counter. "Callan, stop." Her voice was quiet, but it commanded the room. I turned back. Cora hadn't moved away. She reached out. She didn't hesitate, and she didn't ask permission. She took my right hand in hers. Her fingers were rough, calloused from the rains and the mud, but her touch was deliberate and remarkably gentle. She turned my hand over, examining the scrape across the old burn scars. She didn't look at it with pity. She looked at it the same way she looked at the broken wagon wheel, a problem that needed to be understood. "You don't have the leverage on the back end," she murmured, tracing the edge of the scar tissue with her thumb. The contrast of her pale, calloused skin against the angry red and white of my burns was stark. "I manage," I said tightly. My voice sounded rougher than I intended. The proximity was entirely foreign. I could smell the wood smoke in her hair, the faint scent of the lye soap she used. "I didn't say you don't." She reached over with her other hand, picked up a clean rag from her sewing kit, and pressed it firmly against the bleeding scrape. She looked up at me, her face inches from mine. "But you're too proud to admit when you're fighting a losing battle." "Look who's talking." A faint ghost of a smile touched the corners of her mouth. It changed her entire face, softening the harsh lines, revealing a glimpse of the woman she must have been before the world ground her down. "I never claimed I wasn't stubborn," she said softly. She kept her hand wrapped around mine, maintaining the pressure on the cut. I didn't pull away. I stood there rooted to the floorboards, feeling the heat of her skin, the steady pulse in her thumb against the back of my wrist. It was a terrifying thing, allowing someone to hold the weakest part of you. For a long moment, neither of us moved. The wind howled against the heavy window shutters, rattling the iron latch. But inside the cabin, the air was completely still. She finally lowered my hand. She stepped back, breaking the spell, her face returning to its composed, stoic mask. "I'll brace the wood," she said, picking up the hickory spoke. "You focus on the blade. We'll get it cut." I picked up the iron plane. My grip felt a little steadier. "Yeah, we'll get it cut." The sound started around 2 in the morning. A dull, rhythmic thudding coming from the other side of the log wall. At first it bled into the noise of the wind, but it was too heavy, too deliberate. Thud, pause, thud. I sat up, the buffalo hide sliding off my shoulders. The fire was low. I listened. A sharp, high-pitched whinny followed. It sounded strained, unnatural. Cora was out of her bedroll before the echo died. She didn't say a word. She grabbed her boots, shoving her bare feet into the freezing leather, unlacing them entirely. She threw her heavy canvas coat over her sleep shirt and unbolted the door. I grabbed the lantern, struck a match to the wick, and followed her out into the freezing blackness. The cold hit like a physical wall. It was 15 below zero. The air burned my lungs on the first inhale. I held the lantern high as we waded through the snow trench toward the lean-to. Cora was already inside the crude shelter, her hands gripping the wooden rails of the stall. The massive roan draft horse was down. A 2,000-pound animal was not supposed to lie down like that in the winter. He was thrashing his iron-shod hooves, kicking violently against the log walls. Thud, thud! His head was thrown back, eyes rolling white in the lantern light, his massive sides heaving and coated in a thick, freezing sweat. No, no, no! Cora chanted, her voice tight with panic. She scrambled over the rail, dropping into the hay right next to the thrashing hooves. "Cora, get back! He'll crush your skull!" I yelled, setting the lantern on a high peg and vaulting the rail behind her. She ignored me. She grabbed the horse's heavy leather halter, throwing her entire body weight against his neck, trying to force his head down. "Samson, easy, boy, easy." The horse groaned a deep, awful sound from the pit of his belly and kicked out again, shattering a slat of wood near my knee. "It's colic!" I shouted over the wind. "His gut is blocked. The cold must have shocked his system, or he ate snow with the hay." Colic in a draft horse was a death sentence out here. Their intestines twist from the pain and the blockage. Once the gut twists, they die in agony. And if the horse died, Cora's lifeline died with it. Her wagon would be useless. She would be completely, permanently stranded. She knew it. The terror in her eyes was absolute. It wasn't just fear for the animal she loved. It was the sheer crushing dread of losing the last piece of her independence. "We have to get him up," she gasped, struggling against the massive neck. "If he rolls his gut, twists. Help me." I grabbed the thick lead rope attached to the halter. "We can't lift a ton of dead weight, Cora. We have to scare him up." I stepped back, pulled my boot back, and kicked the horse hard in the flank. Not enough to injure, but enough to shock. I cracked the end of the heavy lead rope like a whip against the log wall. The sound was like a gunshot in the confined space. "Get up, Ha! Get up!" I roared, snapping the rope again. Samson snorted, thrashing wildly. Cora hauled upward on the halter with every ounce of strength in her shoulders. The horse rolled onto his chest, scrambled with his front legs, hooves slipping on the icy dirt floor, and finally heaved himself to his feet. He stood there swaying, his head hanging low, his breathing ragged. Okay, he's up." Cora breathed, her hands shaking as she stroked his neck. "Good boy. He's not okay," I warned her. The horse began to buckle his front knees, trying to go down again. "Keep him moving. If he stops, he drops, and he won't get up a second time." I opened the gate of the stall. "Bring him out into the trench." For the next 4 hours we fought a war against the horse and the cold. We walked Samson up and down the 30-yard trench we had dug between the cabin and the woodpile. The snow walls rose to the horse's chest on either side. It was a brutal, agonizing march. The wind had died down, leaving the air brittle and crystalline. The moon broke through the cloud cover, casting a harsh, pale light over the snow. The temperature continued to plummet. Our breath hung in the air in frozen clouds. Cora was on the left side, her arm hooked through the halter. I was on the right, pushing against the horse's heavy shoulder whenever he tried to stop and lie down in the snow. Every step was a battle of wills. The horse was in agony, wanting nothing more than to curl into the snow and die. We wouldn't let him. "Keep walking, Samson." Cora whispered, her voice hoarse, her teeth chattering so hard I could hear it. "Just one more step. Come on." By hour 3, exhaustion set in. Deep, bone-crushing fatigue. Walking in heavy boots through packed snow while muscling a draft horse is enough to break a strong man in broad daylight. In the middle of a sub-zero night, it was torture. Cora stumbled. Her boot caught a buried chunk of ice, and her legs simply gave out. She went down hard onto her knees in the snow. Samson immediately stopped, his knees buckling, preparing to roll. "No!" I shouted. I threw my shoulder under the horse's neck, bracing my legs against the snowbank, holding the massive head up by sheer, desperate force. My burned hand screamed in agony as the leather halter cut into the scar tissue. "Cora, get up." She didn't move. She stayed on her knees, her head bowed, her chest heaving. The cold was sapping the life out of her. The fight was leaving her. "Cora, look at me!" I yelled. She slowly lifted her head. Her face was pale in the moonlight, her lips blue. The fierce, unyielding pride that defined her was gone, stripped away by the freezing night and the crushing weight of circumstance. She looked small, beaten. "I can't," she whispered. "I can't carry it any more, Callan. It's too heavy." She wasn't talking about the horse. She was talking about the wagon in the mud, the forged deed, the husband who shot himself, the endless solitary fight against a world that kept trying to bury her. She had carried it all entirely alone until her legs finally gave out. I held the horse's weight, staring down at her. "You don't have to carry it alone," I said, my voice dropping, the harshness cutting through the freezing air with absolute clarity. "Not tonight. Get up. Take the rope. I've got the shoulder." She stared at me. Her pale blue eyes searched my face in the moonlight. She saw the strain in my jaw, the blood seeping through the rag wrapped around my hand, the sheer refusal to let her fail. Slowly, agonizingly, she pushed herself up from the snow. She didn't say a word. She reached out with her stiff, frozen hands and gripped the lead rope. "Walk," she rasped. We walked. We marched that horse back and forth, turning him at the woodpile, turning him at the cabin door. Our shoulders brushed. Our breath mingled in the freezing air. We became a single machine, moving in unison, keeping the massive beast between us upright. Just as the sky to the east began to turn a bruised slate grey, the horse suddenly stopped. He didn't try to lie down. He snorted violently, shook his massive head, and let out a long, wet sigh. Then he passed the blockage. The relief in the animal was immediate. His ears flicked forward. The rigid tension in his muscles vanished. He dropped his head and began to nose at the snow, looking for grass. "He's through it," I said, my voice cracking. Cora dropped the lead rope. She leaned her forehead against Samson's shoulder, her hands gripping his coarse winter coat. She stood there for a long time, just breathing, feeling the steady, normal rhythm of the horse's heart. I walked around to her side. We were both covered in frost, smelling of sweat pine and horse. She turned her head, resting her cheek against the horse, and looked at me. The defensive walls were completely gone. There was no defiance left, just a raw, exposed gratitude and something else, something warm and terrifying that had been forged in the freezing dark. She reached out. She didn't grab my hand this time. She placed her palm flat against my chest, right over my coat. I could feel the cold radiating from her skin, but beneath it the steady, heavy beat of her heart. "Thank you," she whispered. I looked down at her hand against my chest, then up into her eyes. The space between us, which had been 2 miles wide when I first stepped out of the tree line weeks ago, was gone. "I told you," I murmured, stepping half an inch closer, the cold suddenly entirely forgotten. "Let me help." It started with a single drop. 3 weeks after the blizzard buried the mountain, the temperature crept just above freezing. A shard of ice on the cabin roof softened, pooled and fell, hitting the crusty snow below with a sharp tink. By noon, the single drop had turned into a steady, rhythmic drumming against the log walls. The thaw had come. The mountain didn't give up the snow easily. The pristine white turned to a dirty, porous grey. The trench we had dug to the lean-to collapsed into a muddy river. The air lost its brittle edge, suddenly smelling heavily of wet pine needles, decay, and raw, exposed earth. With the thaw came the silence. The heavy, pressurized silence of an impending departure. We dug the wagon out on a Tuesday. The snow was knee-deep slush. We shoveled for 4 hours, clearing a wide circle around the trapped rear axle. The iron rim of the wheel was rusted, the broken hickory spoke jutting out like a jagged tooth. "We need a fire," I told her, leaning on my shovel. "A hot one. We have to expand the iron tire to get the new spoke and fellow seated right. Cora didn't argue. She waded into the wet brush, dragging out deadfall, stacking it in the mud. We built a ring of fire around the iron tire. The heat hissed against the wet ground, throwing up thick, acrid smoke. I watched her through the haze. She had soot smeared across her cheek. Her heavy coat was unbuttoned, revealing the flannel shirt underneath. She worked with the same relentless drive I had seen the day I met her, but the frantic, desperate edge was gone. She moved with a measured, deliberate calm. "Irons, Cherry," I called out, pulling my heavy leather gloves on. We used 2 thick branches to pry the blistering hot iron rim out of the fire. The heat scorched the hair on my forearms. We dropped it over the wooden frame of the wheel. It slipped on just barely. Water hit it. Cora swung a bucket of icy creek water over the smoking metal. The steam erupted in a blinding white cloud, hissing like a nested rattlesnake. The metal shrieked as it rapidly cooled and shrank, binding the hickory spokes and the oak hub together into a single rock-solid piece. I knelt in the mud, inspecting the joint. I ran my scarred hand over the wood. It was tight. It would hold all the way to the Pacific. "It's done," I said, looking up at her. She stood holding the empty bucket. The steam swirled around her boots. She looked at the wheel, then down the trail. The road was a mess of deep ruts and running meltwater, but it was passable. The trap was sprung. The cage was open. "We'll need to grease the axle before I hitch Samson," she said quietly. Her voice was flat, devoid of whatever warmth we had found in the dark of the cabin. "I've got a tin of axle grease in the shed." I stood up, wiping the mud from my knees. "We'll let the wood dry out tonight. You can roll out at first light." She nodded once, just a sharp jerk of her chin. First light. That night, dinner felt like a wake. We ate salted venison and beans in the cabin. The fire in the hearth felt entirely unnecessary. The heat between us had been replaced by a suffocating, polite distance. She was packing. I watched from my chair as she neatly folded her spare wool blankets, rolling them tight and tying them off with leather straps. She cleaned her Colt Navy, oiling the cylinder with slow, methodical clicks. Every movement was a brick being placed back in the wall she had spent the last 3 weeks tearing down. I wanted to ask her to stay. The words sat in the back of my throat, heavy as lead. But I swallowed them. Cora wasn't a stray dog you could coax onto the porch with a warm fire and a bowl of scraps. She had been trapped by a man's broken promises once. She had crossed half a continent to escape the feeling of being beholden. If I asked her to stay, I became just another anchor tying her down. She finished rolling her canvas pack. She stood up, brushing her hands off on her trousers. She looked around the small cabin. Her eyes lingered on the heavy oak table, the drawer knife still resting on the edge. They lingered on the fire. Finally, they met mine. "I left $3 in silver on the counter," she said, "for the hay and the hickory." I looked at the 3 silver coins sitting next to the coffee grinder. They felt like an insult, but I knew what they were. They were a receipt, proof that she had paid her way, proof that she owed me nothing. "Keep your money, Cora," I said, my voice rougher than I intended. I didn't run a ledger. "I pay my debts," she replied, her jaw setting into that familiar, stubborn line. "It wasn't a debt." I stood up. The chair scraped loudly against the floorboards. "It was just surviving. Keep the silver. You'll need it when you hit the toll roads in Idaho." She stared at me, the muscles in her throat working. For a second I thought the wall was going to crack. I thought she was going to step forward, bridge the gap, and let the whole facade drop. Instead, she gave a stiff nod. She walked over to the counter, picked up the coins, and dropped them into her pocket. "Good night, Callan." "Good night." Morning broke grey and raw. The sky was the colour of a bruised knee, heavy with the threat of spring rain. I stood by the woodpile, a splitting maul resting against my boot, watching her work. She had Samson hitched to the Conestoga by sunrise. The massive roan gelding stamped his hooves in the thick mud, his breath pluming slightly in the damp air. Cora did a final walk-around of the wagon. She checked the traces, tested the tension on the block and tackle she had restowed, and gave the newly repaired wheel a solid kick. It didn't budge. She walked over to me. She was wearing her heavy coat, the felt hat pulled low. The frontier woman had returned, fully armored. "Wheel looks good," she said. "It'll hold." We stood there in the mud. The silence stretched, filled only by the distant rush of the swollen creek and the creak of the leather harness. This was it. The end of the line. Two lives that had violently intersected, destined to pry themselves apart and continue on their separate trajectories. She reached out. She took her right hand, the one with the thick, permanent calluses I had helped her heal, and offered it to me. I looked at it. I took off my leather work glove. I gripped her hand. Her grip was strong, uncompromising. I felt the heat of her skin, remembered the way her hand had felt, pressed flat against my chest in the freezing dark when the world had shrunk to just the two of us. "Thank you," she said, her pale blue eyes locking onto mine. "For the wheel and the horse." "You did the pulling," I said quietly. "Drive safe, Cora. Keep the mountain on your right." She let go of my hand. She turned, walked to the wagon, and climbed up onto the high wooden bench. She took the thick leather reins in her hands, settling her boots against the footboard. "Ha, walk on." She cracked the reins. Samson leaned into the collar. The traces snapped taut. The heavy wagon groaned the iron tires, sucking at the mud, and slowly began to roll forward. I didn't turn away. I watched the wagon lumber down the trail. I watched the canvas roof dip and sway as it hit the deep ruts. I watched until the lodgepole pine swallowed the back end of the Conestoga, and the creak of the wood faded into the rushing sound of the creek. She was gone. I picked up the splitting maul. I set a thick round of wet pine on the chopping block. I swung. The wood split with a wet, heavy thud. I set another round. Swung. Split. I fell into the rhythm of the work, letting the physical exertion drown out the sudden hollow ringing in the cabin behind me. An hour passed. The pile of split wood grew. My canvas coat was soaked with sweat and light drizzle. I was bringing them all down on a knotty piece of spruce when I heard the sound. Squish, squish, squish. Heavy boots walking through thick mud. I froze. I slowly lowered the maul, the heavy iron head resting on the chopping block. I turned around. Cora was walking up the trail. She didn't have the wagon. She didn't have the horse. She was just walking, her hands shoved deep into the pockets of her canvas coat, her felt hat pushed back slightly on her head. She was covered in mud up to her knees, breathing hard from the steep incline. She stopped 10 feet from the woodpile. I stared at her, my heart hammering a sudden violent rhythm against my ribs. Did the wheel break? No, she said. She was out of breath. Wheel is fine. Rolled smooth. Did Samson throw a shoe? Horse is fine. She stepped closer. The wind caught a stray lock of her dark brown hair, blowing it across her face. She didn't brush it away. She just stood there looking at me with an intensity that burned right through the grey morning. "I made it to the fork," she said, her voice carrying clear over the wind. "The road to the valley is completely clear." I looked at the map. I could be in Idaho in 3 weeks. "So what are you doing standing in my mud?" I asked, my voice barely more than a rasp. She took a slow, deep breath. The armored frontier widow was gone. She wasn't running anymore. She wasn't fighting the mud or the snow or the ghosts of dead men. She was just a woman, standing solid on her own 2 feet, making a choice. "I realized something at the fork," she said, stepping up to the chopping block, entirely closing the distance between us. "Oregon is just an idea. It's a piece of paper. It's a place to run to when you've got nothing left." She pulled her hands out of her pockets. She reached out and wrapped her fingers around the scarred, ruined flesh of my right hand. She didn't press a rag to it. She didn't offer pity. She just held it, lacing her calloused fingers through mine. "I'm done running, Callan," she whispered, looking up into my face. "I don't want an idea. I want what's real. And the only real thing I've found in 1,000 miles is right here on this mountain." I looked down at our hands. I looked at the fierce, beautiful, stubborn woman standing in front of me. She wasn't staying because she needed a roof. She wasn't staying because she was trapped. She was staying because she chose to. I dropped them all. I took her face in both of my rough hands, feeling the cold dampness on her cheeks, and pulled her in. When I kissed her, it wasn't a spark. It was the entire fire. It was the heat of the hearth, the sheer force of the blizzard, and the deep abiding strength of the earth, thawing under the sun. She kissed me back, with the same desperate, undeniable gravity, her hands gripping the front of my coat, grounding herself to me. We had both spent our lives building walls to keep the world out. But standing there in the mud, surrounded by the towering pines, we finally let them fall. She was 40, and she needed absolutely no one. But she wanted me, and that was enough to build a life on. That brings us to the end of Callan and Cora's journey. Two broken people who found out that sometimes the road you're meant to be on is the one you get stuck on. I hope this story brought you some genuine emotion and proved that romance doesn't have to be perfectly polished to be powerful. If you loved this gritty, grounded tale, please do me a huge favor. Hit that like button, subscribe to the channel for more original Western stories, and share this video with a friend who appreciates a real slow burn romance. Thanks for listening.